Beverly Hills, 1960. The private dining room at Romanoff's was supposed to be safe territory. Studio executives, a director whose last 3 pictures had flopped, 2 actors whose careers depended on this film getting made, and Marilyn Monroe, sitting across from the man who'd just compared her intelligence to a starlet he'd fired that morning. He'd said it quietly, like he was ordering another martini. Nobody laughed, but nobody stopped him either. What I'm going to tell you today happened in rooms most people never entered. These are the stories that didn't make the columns, the moments that shaped who Marilyn really was beneath all that light. If you want to hear more stories like this, the ones Hollywood kept quiet, subscribe now because some things were never meant to be forgotten. The dinner had started civil enough. Contracts were nearly signed. The film needed Marilyn more than she needed the film, but nobody said that part out loud. She'd arrived on time, dressed simply, hair pulled back in a way that made her look younger than 34. The producer, Milton Jaffe, had built his reputation on discovering talent and destroying it when it no longer served him. He was 62, respected, feared, and entirely convinced that his position meant he could say anything. The comment came during dessert. Someone had asked Marilyn about a book she'd mentioned in a recent interview. She'd been reading Dostoevsky, she said, and found it harder than she expected, but worth the effort. Jaffe set down his coffee cup and smiled the way men smile when they're about to say something they believe is harmless. "Well, I suppose everyone needs a hobby," he said. "Even girls who got passed around foster homes instead of going to school." The table went still. Not silent. The kind of waiter was still pouring water. Someone's fork touched porcelain. But still in the way rooms get when a line has been crossed and everyone knows it. The director looked down. One of the actors tried to smile but couldn't manage it. Jaffe didn't seem to notice. He was already reaching for another cigarette, already moving past it, like he'd commented on the weather. Marilyn didn't flinch. That's what people always missed when they wrote about her later. She didn't freeze or look hurt or excuse herself to the powder room. She set her napkin on the table, very slowly, and looked at Jaffe the way you look at someone you're deciding whether to remember. Her hands were steady. Her voice, when it came, was quieter than anyone expected. "You're right," she said. "I didn't get much formal schooling. I learned other things instead." She paused, just long enough for him to think she was finished. "I learned how to recognize when someone's using cruelty because they've run out of relevance." Another pause. "I imagine that's harder to learn at a good school." She didn't raise her voice. She didn't perform. She just said it and let it sit there, like a fact no one could argue with. Jaffe's face changed. Not dramatically, not all at once, but in small ways. The smile tightened. His hand stopped halfway to the ashtray. He looked at her like he was seeing something he hadn't accounted for. The director cleared his throat and said something about the shooting schedule. One of the actors asked about locations. The conversation moved forward because it had to, because that's what people did in rooms like that when someone had been cut, and everyone pretended not to see the blood. But the energy had shifted. The power had shifted. Jaffe didn't speak to Marilyn again for the rest of the meal. When she left, she thanked the table, shook hands with the director, and walked out like nothing had happened. But it had happened. Everyone there knew it. Jaffe had expected her to shrink, to apologize, to prove him right about who she was. Instead, she'd done something worse. She'd made him small without even trying. The film got made, but Jaffe wasn't part of it. The studio replaced him 3 weeks later. No official reason was given, but people talked. They said Marilyn had made a call. She hadn't. She didn't need to. What had happened in that room moved through Hollywood the way certain stories do. Not loud, not public, but known. The people who mattered heard it, and they adjusted. It wasn't the first time someone had used her past like a weapon. The foster homes, the loneliness, the years of being told she wasn't smart enough, wasn't worth keeping. All of it was public record by then. Interviewers asked about it. Columnists referenced it. Directors used it to justify why they could treat her however they wanted. She was damaged goods, they said. She should be grateful for the work. But Marilyn had learned something those men never understood. Survival wasn't weakness. Endurance wasn't passivity. She'd been discarded more times than most of them had been loved, and she was still here. That wasn't luck. That was will. There was another moment, earlier that same year, on a set in Los Angeles. The director was younger than Jaffe, angrier, more desperate to prove himself. The picture was over budget and behind schedule, and Marilyn had been late to set twice that week. Not because she was careless, but because sleep had become something that happened in pieces, if it happened at all. The director stopped the scene mid-take and called her over. In front of the crew, in front of the other actors, he told her she was lucky anyone hired her at all. "You know what you are," he said, loud enough for the grips to hear. "You're what happens when nobody wants you as a kid, so you spend your whole life begging strangers to look at you." The set went cold. The script supervisor stopped writing. The cinematographer turned off his light meter. Marilyn stood there 5 feet from the camera in a costume that wasn't hers and makeup that made her look like someone else. She didn't cry. She didn't argue. She waited until he was finished, until he'd said everything he needed to say to feel powerful again. Then she smiled. Not a real smile, not one that reached her eyes, but the kind of smile you give someone when you understand them better than they understand themselves. "You might be right," she said softly, "but at least when people look at me, they see something worth remembering." She let that settle. What do they see when they look at you? She walked off set. Didn't ask permission, didn't wait for a response, just left. Production shut down for the day. The director tried to spin it later, said she was difficult, said she couldn't handle criticism, but the crew knew what they'd seen, and they remembered. What people never wrote about, what the biographies left out, was how often this happened. Not every day, not every week, but often enough that Marilyn had developed a kind of internal system for it. She could feel it coming before the words arrived. The shift in tone, the casual cruelty disguised as observation, the assumption that her past made her fair game. She never got used to it. That's important. She never stopped feeling the sting, never stopped hearing the echoes of every adult who'd told her she wasn't enough. But she learned to separate the feeling from the response. She learned that silence could be louder than screaming. That control was a form of power they didn't expect from her. In 1961, during pre-production for what would be her last completed film, a journalist showed up to interview her at home. He was older, credentialed, the type who wrote for serious publications and believed his age gave him license to say things younger men couldn't. He asked about her marriages, her miscarriages, her mother's illness. All of it phrased as curiosity, all of it designed to make her relive pain for his readers' entertainment. Then he leaned back and said, almost kindly, "Do you ever wonder if all this happened because you were never taught how to be loved properly?" He said it like he was offering insight, like he was helping. Marilyn looked at him for a long time, long enough that he started to shift in his seat, long enough that the publicist in the corner stopped pretending to read her notes. When Marilyn finally spoke, her voice was steady and clear. "I was taught exactly how to be loved," she said. "I was taught that love is conditional, that it can be taken away, that you have to earn it every single day, and even then, it might not be enough." She stood up, smoothed her dress, and walked to the window. The journalist waited, pen ready, thinking she'd continue. She didn't. After a moment, the publicist stood and thanked him for coming. The interview was over. It never ran. The truth was, Marilyn understood something most people spent their whole lives avoiding. She understood that cruelty often came from people who needed to feel superior, who needed to diminish others to feel whole. She understood that her past, the abandonment, the instability, the loneliness, wasn't a weakness. It was proof she'd survived things that would have destroyed weaker people. But Hollywood didn't want survival stories. Hollywood wanted victims or vixens, nothing in between. They wanted her vulnerable enough to control, but strong enough to sell tickets. They wanted her grateful for their attention, but punishable when she asked for respect. It was an impossible position, and she knew it. What stayed with people who really knew her wasn't the image. It was the moments when the image cracked and something else showed through. Something harder, sharper, more deliberate than anyone expected. The moments when she stopped performing and started calculating. When she chose her words like weapons and used them with precision. There was a party in 1962, just months before she died. Someone, a producer, a hanger-on, it didn't matter, made a joke about how many people had passed her around over the years. He said it casually, like it was a known fact, like her life was a punchline everyone agreed on. People laughed. Not everyone, but enough. Marilyn didn't leave. She didn't make a scene. She waited until the laughter died down, until the room was quiet again, and then she said very simply, "The difference between you and me is that when people talk about me, they remember my name." She looked at him directly. "Can you say the same?" The room stayed quiet. Someone changed the subject. The party continued. But later, people would remember that moment. They'd remember that Marilyn Monroe, who the world had decided was fragile and lost, had stood in a room full of people who believed they owned her and reminded them that they didn't. The pattern repeated throughout her life. Someone with power would test her, would use her past as permission to diminish her, and she would respond, not with anger, not with volume, but with a kind of quiet certainty that shifted the balance. She never apologized for surviving. She never pretended the pain hadn't been real. She just refused to let it define her the way they wanted it to. What made it remarkable wasn't that she fought back. What made it remarkable was how she fought back. With dignity, with restraint, with the understanding that the best way to disarm someone who's trying to hurt you is to show them their cruelty without needing to name it. Years later, people who'd been in those rooms, the dinners, the sets, the parties, would talk about her differently than the public did. They'd talk about her intelligence, her awareness, her ability to see through people faster than they saw through themselves. They'd talk about how she never forgot a slight but never wasted energy on revenge, how she simply moved forward, leaving certain people behind without looking back. The tragedy wasn't that she was fragile. The tragedy was that she was strong in ways Hollywood didn't value. She was strong enough to survive childhood neglect, strong enough to build a career in an industry designed to break her, strong enough to stand in rooms full of powerful men and refuse to be small for their comfort. But strength like that doesn't always look like strength. It looks like control. It looks like silence. It looks like someone who's learned that the most powerful thing you can do is choose not to react the way people expect you to. And in an industry built on spectacle, on drama, on performances that never stopped, that kind of strength was easy to miss. The people who used her past against her thought they were exposing weakness. They thought they were putting her in her place, reminding her where she came from, who she really was beneath the makeup and the lights. They thought they had power because they could say cruel things and get away with it. What they didn't understand was that every time they tried to break her with her own history, they were proving something she already knew. That survival was the truest form of strength. That making it through childhood without love, without stability, without anyone telling you that you mattered, and still becoming someone the whole world knew, wasn't a sign of damage. It was a sign of will. Marilyn never said that out loud. She didn't need to. She lived it. In every quiet response to cruelty. In every moment she chose dignity over spectacle. In every room where someone expected her to collapse, and she simply didn't. Stories like this, the ones that show who people really were when the cameras stopped rolling, they matter. They show us that strength isn't always loud, and power isn't always obvious. If you want to keep hearing the stories Hollywood tried to bury, the moments that reveal who these people really were, make sure you're subscribed. Some truths deserve to be remembered. The final months of her life were chaotic, painful, marked by the same patterns that had followed her since childhood. People took what they needed and left. People used her and blamed her for being used. People saw her struggling and called it weakness instead of recognizing it as the cost of surviving what she'd survived. But even then, even at the end, there were moments when the old strength showed through. Moments when someone would say something cruel, something designed to hurt, and she would respond with the same quiet precision she'd always had. Moments when she reminded people that despite everything, despite all of it, she was still here, still standing, still refusing to be what they needed her to be. The world remembers Marilyn Monroe as a tragedy, as someone who wanted to be loved and never was, as someone fragile, broken, lost. And maybe parts of that are true. Maybe she did want love more than most people. Maybe she did feel broken sometimes. Maybe she did get lost. But the people who were really there, the ones who saw her in those moments when the mask came off, they remember something else too. They remember someone who understood cruelty and chose not to return it. Someone who'd been hurt more times than anyone should be and still found ways to be kind. Someone who knew exactly how much power she had and used it carefully, deliberately, only when it mattered. That's the story Hollywood didn't tell. That's the woman the biographies missed. Not the victim, not the icon. Just Marilyn, complicated, aware, stronger than anyone gave her credit for, and tired of proving it to people who would never really see her anyway. She wanted to be loved, but more than that, she wanted to be seen, really seen. Not as a reflection of someone else's fantasy or failure, but as herself, whole, human, enough. Hollywood couldn't give her that. Maybe nobody could, but she spent her whole life asking for it anyway. And that, more than anything, is what made her unforgettable.